Alright, so this is the first lecture and we are going to talk about some theoretical basics before actually starting up with the real hacking. So there are some important things which I have to cover in this lecture so that we can have a clear base on which we will build upon from the next lectures. So I have divided today's lecture into 3 parts. The first one is some very basic things. Second one is about some more specific to pen testing things. And the third section will be about some terms which you should know about in the industry before actually starting up with the real hacking. Okay? So the first thing is, how can hacking ever be ethical? So, because many people, I would say generally the people who are not that involved in technology, they always have this doubt or this question in mind that how can hacking ever be ethical? Because whenever they think about hacking, they think about destructions, someone's Facebook account getting hacked, or even worse, someone's bank account getting hacked, and they're losing all their money through that. Or they think about a company got attacked, its reputation got damaged, or some other bad thing. So most of the people have this image of hacking in their mind that it is bad. But in reality, it's just the aspect of thinking. It's not always bad, it can be ethical. So let me explain this to you with an example. Just think about fire. When you think about fire, you're generally thinking about something getting burnt and then destroyed. Or you think about extreme high temperatures and uncomfortable environments. But is that all the use of the fire? No. If you can use the fire to burn a home, you can even use the same fire to cook your food. So it's just the way you're using the fire. So fire is not dangerous by itself. In the same way, hacking isn't good or bad by itself. It's always how you use it. So for an example, you can either steal information and sell it, or help companies secure themselves and their environments and their security mechanisms, controls, and all that security stuff with the same base of knowledge, which is hacking. So never think about hacking as something bad. Hacking is never good or bad by itself. If we have to talk about bad hacking, we have a term called cracking, which we use for that. If we have to talk about good hacking, we have the term ethical hacking. But hacking itself is not good or bad by itself. I hope that makes sense, and let's move on to the next topic, which is pen testing and difference between ethical hacking and penetration testing. So first thing first, what exactly is penetration testing? Well, in simple words, I can say that pen test simply means simulating a test to see what damage can occur to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our assets. What that means is you're basically testing the risk of already placed security controls using your hacking techniques. Then we come to ethical hacking versus penetration testing. So this is always a confusion. People think, okay, ethical hacking means hacking for good reasons, that's okay. But penetration testing, well, that is also good hacking. So how are these two terms different? Well, I want to make this thing very clear that ethical hacking or even hacking is just knowledge, okay? It's not really any kind of field or job. Right, ethical hacker is not a job role. Penetration testing is. So, ethical hacking is just knowledge on the basis of which a lot of ethical hacking fields work. Fields like penetration testing, bug hunting, even cybersecurity manager or consultants or security analysts or auditors. So, there are so many real jobs which work on the knowledge of ethical hacking. It's always about the use of ethical hacking. But ethical hacking is not a job role by itself. So I hope that makes sense. And penetration testing is also one of the fields or jobs which work on a specific way on the ethical hacking knowledge. Now once you get that, we can move on to the approaches, types and phases of penetration testing. So there are basically three main ways or approaches in which a pen test can be conducted. First one is black box. Now black box is basically about a condition or doing a pen test in a way or in a situation where you don't have any prior information about the target or even any kind of access. So it's all very similar to the real world hacking. It's known as the best approach of doing pen testing. Then you have gray box penetration testing approach. Now gray box is basically a condition or a situation where you're given some limited access or knowledge about your target and you're asked to further try to break things from that point. White box is also very simple, as in black box we know that okay, there is no information given. In gray box there is some limited information given. So in the same way, in the white box there are all the required information given. So it's actually not a kind of real intrusive hacking or things. It's mostly about studying the data or information that we have and identifying any weak points or problems from that point. Okay. Then you have types. Now types of penetration testing can be many. Here are some of the major ones. It's not that only these types of penetration testing are there. There can be more, but again, this is just the major ones which you need to know. So first of all, there is the network penetration testing. Network penetration testing will include the testing of network, systems, hosts, and devices such as routers and switches. Web may include the website itself, the web server on which the website is hosted, the database which the website uses, and other things like API, applets, plugins, and a lot much more. So it's never limited. Then we have client-side penetration testing, in which we test browser, email clients, Flash, content creation apps such as Photoshop, media player, and many things. So yeah, this is also about the client side. It's more about the general softwares that we use, using them to hack into a target. Just like I said previously, media player like VLC. So if that has got some problem, if you're using that, because that's a general software, not a network service or something else, then that's a client-side type of attack. It's generally combined with social engineering. Now about social engineering, we will talk about this in a few minutes, so wait till then. Then wireless hacking will include anything related to wireless communications, from cables of Wi-Fi till the routers and everything in between. So it's all about wireless communication and the devices involved in that. Okay, and lastly you have physical penetration testing. So as the name suggests, it's about breaking the physical barriers, such as the infrastructure, building, or physically breaking or harming the systems and playing with the wires, disrupting things in that way, or even tackling the employees. So yeah, they can be a type of security control which you may need to break in some point. So these were quite a few types of penetration testing. Once again, I would say these are not everything. There might be more, but this is what we consider in general penetration testing. Just for an example, you may have heard about cloud testing or cloud penetration testing. I want to tell you that cloud testing is a field in itself. Cloud security includes it. So there are some things which you may call comes into penetration testing. However, the way we use them is really different from these. That's why we don't include them into our list of general penetration testing. Then we can look at the phases of penetration testing. As you can see, there is the pre-attack phase, there is the attack phase, and there is the post-attack phase. So as you can simply guess, pre-attack will include all the planning and structuring that we do before starting a penetration test. Attack phase is basically the phase where we actually do the technical stuff and testing of whatever targets we have. And then we have post-attack phase. So this can include all the meetings with your client which you do after completion of the penetration test, maybe in order to explain them the results, and it may also include the reporting. So I think these three topics are very clear to you, and let's move on to the next one. Then we have something very simple called technical hacking and non-technical hacking. Technical hacking, as the name suggests, it's basically about technically breaking the security. And non-technical hacking is about breaking the people related to those targets. So in non-technical hacking, what we would do is basically social engineering, because I said that I'll explain you social engineering in a few minutes. This is the point. Now, social engineering, well, it's basically about playing with emotions of people, exploiting their emotions, or as you know, the subconscious mind of people still work in the way in which it did some 1,000 years ago. So those emotions and the way of working of their mind, that's always going to remain same until and unless they're educated about the topic of social engineering and such kind of fraudulent stuff. So essentially what we do in social engineering is we apply different techniques and we try to lure the victim into doing something that we want them to do. We have a whole separate domain on just the topic of social engineering in this course, so don't worry about that. We will talk about it in very deep manner later on. And technical hacking, as we talked about, will include all those other types of attacks or tests which are not social engineering, such as network, web, client-side, wireless, physical, all those. Okay? So with that, we complete the very first part of this lecture. Let's move on to the next one. So now we have to talk about methodologies, standards, and compliance. I think that these are some of the most important things to know as a professional penetration tester. Methodologies. So what is a methodology? Methodology is basically a step-by-step procedure of doing something. So in our case, we are talking about pen testing. So how do we exactly do pen testing? What tools do we use? How do we execute them? What are some tips and recommendations that we should apply or implement during our tests? So all those things are defined in a methodology. There are many methodologies for penetration testing available on the internet. The one which I would like to talk about in here is OSSTMM. It's called the Open Source Security Testing Methodology Manual, and it can be used as a penetration testing or security testing or security analysis or even measurement of the operational security of a target. So it's kind of a multi-topic methodology, but you can definitely use it for penetration testing. Now this is basically some 200 to 300 pages document and defines some steps which you should take into consideration whenever doing a penetration test. So it is always chosen by you, okay? Whenever you start a pen test, you always decide the methodology, which methodology and whatever things you will be using. All that is decided in the pre-engagement or pre-attack phase of any penetration test. So that's a really important thing to know. I hope you will read that OSSTMM document yourself. I'm not sure if I can really show you that on the screen or not, because it may create some problems for me in case that is copyright or something. So yeah, let's not take risk, and I hope you will check that out yourself. Then we have standards. So what are standards? Well, standards basically define some required test specifications. They tell us that what are the minimum requirements and basically the level of requirements of a test. In case of penetration testing, these standards will provide you a way of how to use your hacking process in a much more effective way and in a much more safer way. So standards is also something will be defined in the pre-engagement phase, when you use a standard, you basically improve the confidence and trust of the client towards you. Because then if you say that you're following a standard, they know that you're going to do it in a more safer way. And in professional environments, we never perform tests randomly. Like, we don't use any tool or something randomly. We always have a defined procedure and a safe way to execute everything. And one thing to know is that standards will not tell you the exact technique or tool which you have to use. It's just like recommendations, sort of. So that's something you need to choose whenever starting a new penetration testing engagement. And methodologies, again, it's different from standards in the sense that it will actually talk about the tools and stuff like that. For an example of penetration testing standards, I can talk about the NIST Special Publication 800-115. So this is called the Technical Guide to Information Security Testing and Assessment. It's a very popular security testing standard used by many organizations. So if they're using this standard, you have to take all the recommendations from this particular standard and implement them into your penetration test. So I hope that makes sense. And this is also a document which you can read. I think I can show this to you. So let's just check it out. Okay, you can see all these things in the beginning, introduction. And just for an example, this will tell you log review. So how do you do log review? And how do you review system configurations? And it will suggest you on some things about network sniffing. Or we can take more technical things. It will aid you in network discovery. Will tell you that, okay, what are the things which you should always check and keep in mind in perspective of security whenever doing vulnerability scanning or wireless scanning or whatever you're doing. So all these things are basically told in here. Okay? And I hope you will check this out yourself again, because that's kind of something big and I won't be able to explain this to you. These are literally 100-200 pages long. And the OSSTMM which I talked about earlier, that was around 250 pages long. You don't have to memorize those, just go through them once so that you can get the core idea of what they are trying to say and what are they recommending. Because there are really some core ideas which you can get from these and you won't have to memorize these then. Okay? And actually, you don't just have one or two standards, you have many. So one of them which I showed you was NIST 800-115 Special Publication. Another one which I can show you is called PTES, Penetration Testing Execution Standard. Now this is another standard used by many organizations in this world, and it basically consists of 7 major sections in which it defines the way you have to use penetration testing methods or techniques or whatever you're using. Okay? So you can see clearly it tells you about pre-engagement interactions, intelligence gathering, threat modeling, vulnerability analysis, exploitation, post-exploitation, reporting, and all those things into itself. And another example which I can give you of a methodology can be the OWASP testing guide. So you can see it's in the recommendations. So this is also a methodology. It is more focused upon the web hacking side. It tells you how to conduct a wide range of different website hacking tests on applications to check their security. So yeah, this is another example. Then we have compliance. So compliance is basically nothing but making sure that our company and the employees who are working follow all the rules, regulation, standards, and ethical practices that apply to the organization. So basically following a rule or an order. Now compliance, as you can see, can be regulatory, legal, as well as some internal policies of the organization itself and even the bylaws. compliance is actually a very important thing to take into consideration as a penetration tester. So your client might have some compliance that impacts in their industry and thus also their organization. So if they have such a compliance, you need to follow those rules and orders and whatever is mentioned in their basically the documents, the different compliances. There are many different compliances available. There is PCI DSS, HIPAA, GDPR, and many more. So PCI DSS is for payment card industry. So this will tell you that okay, how many times you need to do pen test in an year, like maybe once a year or twice a year. It will tell you that. It will not tell you actually, it will tell the client company of yours that what they have to do, but because your client has to follow these compliances as it is a requirement, not an option for them. So if you just say before starting of a penetration test that you know the requirements and all the recommendations mentioned in their compliances, then they will have even more better trust on you. So it's basically about their trust, and it should not get them into any problem, because if they don't follow compliance practices during an audit, they may face a lot of problems. PCI DSS is basically for any and every company who works in the payment card industry who process credit card information. HIPAA is another compliance for the health care industry. So there are so many of these. FISMA is another one, Secure Federal Government. It actually is very much related to the risk management framework. Critical controls is another important one, and common criteria is actually for computer security. It's like an international standard for it. So similarly they have so many. You can see SOX is another one. So there are just so many in this world, and it really depends upon your client. So if your client has some compliance requirements, make sure you ask them about it in the planning phase itself, so that you know in which way you have to work and what are the limits and what are the things which are must to do. This was about methodologies, standards, and compliance. I know it might be a little confusing or difficult for you right now, but this is really something you have to understand, because most of the people whom I know, they don't understand the importance of compliance standards and methodologies in conducting any kind of penetration test. So if you got this right now, you are on a much better position. Also, let's look at the process of security testing. Now, we have information gathering as the first step. It's always the first step actually on any kind of security testing, not just penetration testing. So, information gathering is simply finding as much information as possible about the target. Vulnerability analysis is the phase where we use the identified data in order to recognize different vulnerabilities, and we study those vulnerabilities. Then we take advantage of those vulnerabilities, or we abuse those vulnerabilities using exploits in the phase of exploitation. In post-exploitation, we use more things such as preserving our access or privilege escalation in case we had some excess. But exploitation is not just always about gaining access, it can be damaging any part of the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the target. And lastly, you have house cleaning. This is included in some processes and in some others it's not. I just included it, and it basically means bringing back the system into the same state in which it was before starting the pen test. So essentially it's removing remnants of the penetration test. So whatever leftovers were there after your penetration test. Now this was the process of security testing in general, but if you talk about penetration testing, it needs a specific type of planning because it's a specific type in which security testing might be conducted, and reporting will also be different according to the planning. So these were some of the things in this section, and let's move on to the next one. Then we have vulnerability, exploits, and payload. It's a really simple concept, and let's start with the first one, which is vulnerability. Vulnerability is basically a weakness. So it's a bug or glitch or flaw or any other kind of weakness present in the target. Exploit is basically a piece of code which you use to abuse that vulnerability. Now payload and exploit, let me explain this to you how they work together. Now these are interdependent, so if you have to use a payload, you need an exploit as well. And if you want to use exploit to do something, payload is always required. So just think about exploit as a gun and payload as a bullet. Payload is something that the exploit will actually throw into the target, and this will help us do destructions. Just like a gun throws the bullet into the target, and then that bullet causes further destruction. So it's all about that concept. Now this will be much more clear when we actually start hacking. Right now I just want to give you a basic idea of what this stuff actually is. Then you have scope, asset, risk. Scope, just think of it as a list of devices or targets which you're allowed to hack. So which systems, which applications, or which any kind of targets you're allowed to hack during any kind of penetration test. Asset is anything valuable to the organization. It can be some software, some kind of hardware, it can be the information itself, or it can be the people, because they are also important assets. Then you have risk. So you can think about risk as the probability of the vulnerability being exploited or abused by the payload. Then you have common vulnerability exposure. So common vulnerability exposure is basically the CVE in short form. So whenever security researchers identify a new type of vulnerability and they report it, the vulnerability is assigned a CVE. So we just tag a CVE number to the vulnerability for its specific reference, so that whenever we need to talk about that specific vulnerability, we can ask someone to refer to the particular CVE of that particular vulnerability. I hope that makes sense, and actually there are many websites where we can learn about CVE. So one of them is called CVE Details. This is one of my favorite websites for finding vulnerabilities. You will get to know about it in the later lectures where we actually start hacking. But you can see we can enter any CVE ID, or let me show you how the CVE numbers may look like. I can open it. So you can see CVE. Okay, let me zoom it first of all so that you can see it. So yeah, CVE-2000- some number, right? Some identification number. So first of all, it's CVE, then the year it was found, and then this number for its unique identification. And then you have some details about the vulnerability. So CVE is basically the number assigned to a particular vulnerability. Okay? And then you lastly have vulnerability assessment versus penetration testing. Simply think that in vulnerability assessment, we identify, analyze, and rank a vulnerability, but do not test or exploit the vulnerability to test its exact causes or impacts on the system. Whereas in penetration testing, we do test the exploits, we do measure the actual risk associated with the use of that particular exploit and that vulnerability being exploited. So in vulnerability assessment, things are not confirmed that what exactly will be impacts, whereas in penetration testing, you do your exploitation and post-exploitation and house cleaning and whatever all that stuff to complete the security test. So that's basically the difference between vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. And with that, we come to the end of this lecture, theoretical basics. I hope whatever I taught you in this lecture would have made sense. Now you will understand these things in a much more clear manner when we actually get into the practical hacking. So that's exactly what we are going to start from the next lecture itself. Till then, have a great day, and let me have a leave now.